In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem, asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star in the east, and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the Magi and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. I don't know how many times I have read that story over the years. But this year, when I read it, I asked a question that I had never asked before. I wondered what it would be like to be in that group of chief priests and scribes summoned to answer a strange question from the king for no apparent reason. What would they be feeling and thinking? And then I asked myself, given that the Gospel of Matthew likely sets this story just before the death of King Herod, which occurred in 4 BCE, couldn't we actually know who some of those people might have been who were there? For example, who was the high priest at that time? Surely he would have been included in the group. Well, it turns out that we do know who was the high priest at the beginning of 4 BCE. And, in fact, we know enough about him to suggest that there might just be quite a story about what such a man would have thought and felt and experienced that night. This is Retelling the Bible. Episode 8.27. How Christmas Radicalized Simeon. Simeon ben Boethus had been the high priest for about 19 years. By this point, you would have thought that he should have earned the respect of all the people. He should have earned the respect of the king. But he actually lived in constant fear that at any moment he might be rejected by both. That is why, when he heard the soldiers pounding on his door just a few minutes before midnight, he could not stop himself from trembling all over his body. When he asked what the ruckus was all about, the soldiers shouted that King Herod required all of the chief priests and the scribes to come to him at once. Simeon immediately jumped out of bed and hastily put on a robe. He knew that he did not have any choice. After all, Herod had had high priests killed before. Early on in his reign, Herod had appointed his own brother-in-law as high priest. This obvious nepotism did not go unnoticed, of course. It made it clear to everyone that Herod was really only interested in what was good for Herod. But it also showed that if he favored you, great wealth and power could be yours. But success could also be very dangerous. Less than a year after he appointed him, Herod had his brother-in-law murdered because he dared to cross him. As a successor high priest, Simeon reminded himself daily of that incident. He never forgot that his own wealth and power was due to only one thing: the fact that he had a daughter of such legendary beauty that King Herod had been willing to elevate him to such an exalted position in order to make his daughter noble enough to marry her. He also knew that if he ever displeased the king, it could all disappear in a moment. So, when Herod the Great sent him a messenger in the middle of the night that told him to jump, Simeon knew that the only acceptable response was to say, "How high, sire?" Simeon convened the group of chief priests and scribes in an antechamber of the palace. They were all just as grumpy and frightened as he was. They had not seen the king himself when they arrived, so they had no idea what sort of tantrum he might be having. For all they knew, he had rounded them up in one place to murder them over some imagined slight. When the message came through that the king wanted them to tell him where the Messiah was supposed to be born, they didn't know whether to be relieved or enraged. "What are we?" one of the scribes asked. "Some sort of GPS that he can call up in the middle of the night to answer random geography questions?" But any anger was quickly tamped down. They all knew that if Herod wanted an answer, they had better get him an answer, and quick. They moved into the library of the nearby temple, a room where the precious scrolls of the scripture were kept. They began to search desperately for something, anything, written by any prophet that might be taken as talking about the Messiah and that even mentioned a place. After several hours frantically unrolling and rolling parchments and squinting at the ancient script by lamplight, one of them finally cried out, "I think I've found something." He picked up the scroll of the prophet Micah and carefully sounded out the words. "But You, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah, who are one of the little clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to rule in Israel, whose origin is from of old, from ancient days. Everyone was so relieved to have a clear, straightforward answer to give the demanding monarch that I don't think that they really thought through the implications of the ancient prophet's words. They just shoved the scroll into the high priest's hands and said, "Go, go! Take this to Herod right now, before he loses all patience with us." As the priest stepped into the audience chamber, clutching the scroll, he glanced nervously at the king. He could tell that he was worried about something. He seemed very much on the edge of panic. Simeon had no idea what to make of the others who were there. Strange travelers who had clearly come from a great distance. Their exotic clothing marked them as magi, priests who were revered by the Persians. But there was no time to puzzle over the strange outsiders. Herod was gesturing impatiently. "Well, you've certainly taken your time. What is the answer? Where is this blasted I mean, where is this blessed Messiah supposed to be born?" "In Bethlehem, just as Micah said," the priest replied. But as he lifted the scroll of the prophet to read, something came over Simeon. He had to translate the text. Herod didn't speak ancient Hebrew, and you can't really translate a text without interpreting somewhat. So that might explain why what came out of his mouth sounded like this. "And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people, Israel." Simeon ben Boethus watched silently as Herod carefully questioned the Magi concerning various astrological signs. He didn't really understand what they were talking about, but he knew his son-in-law well enough to see that he was planning something thoroughly evil. As he watched, the words he had just read continued to echo in his ears. "Who is to shepherd my people Israel?" Herod might be many things, but he was no shepherd to his people. He was more wolf than shepherd. But if Herod had fleeced the people, if he was nothing but a self-serving narcissist, what did it mean if Simeon himself supported that, even profited from it? What did that make him? Simeon didn't know what he thought about the coming of a Messiah. The very idea of such a figure seemed to be dangerous and disruptive, especially to people of his class. A Messiah didn't seem like a good idea to him. But the words of the prophet had reminded him that God did have thoughts about how his people ought to be led and taken care of. And God wanted nothing to do with the kind of regime that he himself had supported out of fear and greed. Maybe, just maybe, God wanted Simeon ben Boethus to do something about that. The Gospel of Matthew doesn't offer a date for the birth of Jesus, but it does say that it happened before Herod the Great died. And, since Herod died in 4 BCE, most scholars would presume that Matthew sets the scene with the Magi shortly before the king's death, with the birth of Jesus having occurred perhaps a couple of years earlier. And we do know a few things about that historical setting. We do know that Simeon ben Boethus was the high priest at the beginning of that year, and that he was the king's father-in-law. We also know that later that same year, Simeon conspired with his daughter and a son of Herod named Antipater to remove Herod from power. Makes me wonder, could he have been radicalized by events that occurred when he was summoned with the chief priests and scribes to consult the scriptures about what the coming of the Messiah might mean? Christmas is a wonderful time to celebrate the birth of a child whose coming means peace, hope, and love. It is a sentimental festival when we gather with loved ones and enjoy ourselves. But don't forget that it is also a challenge. If the Messiah came, he came to challenge all of us to stand up and confront the evil and the systemic rot of this world. He might have even challenged a high priest, who never even met him, to do that. Whatever you believe, or don't believe about him, will you let this story challenge you to do that too? I wish I could say that powerful, self-serving narcissists have disappeared from this world. But they haven't. Some of them only seem to be getting more powerful. How will you let the story of Christmas radicalize you? That is it for this episode and for this season of Retelling the Bible. Please subscribe so you can get the next regular episode in 2 weeks' time next year. The theme music for the podcast is Da by Kevin MacLeod, and the mood music for this episode was Atomic by Sasha End. The music is licensed in the Creative Commons and can be found at incompetech.com and at ND app, respectively. You can contact me on Blue Sky at Retelling the Bible and on the Facebook page Retelling the Bible.
Show notes for this episode have been posted at retellingthebible.wordpress.com. Thanks to my Patreon supporters. You've been amazing all year. Go to patreon.com/retellingthebible to support this podcast. This is Retelling the Bible, and I am your storyteller, W. Scott McCandless, wishing you and yours a Merry Christmas.